Welcome to Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle. I'm Bobby Owsinski, and this is a show all about music, music production, and the music business. This week we're going to part 2 with former manager of the Police and IRS Records founder, Miles Copeland. First of all, artificial intelligence is becoming a bigger and bigger part of the music business. Recently, in the Q3 earnings call for Warner Music, the CEO mentioned that they're going to be signing 100% new artists, thanks to their AI-driven app called Sodatone. That means twice as many artists on the roster, thanks to artificial intelligence. Now, Sodatone analyzes the 40,000 plus tracks that are uploaded to Spotify every day. Then it looks at all the social media and the touring data to see if it can spot new artists and new trends. At that point, when a new artist is discovered, it's then handed off to some real people who can then do the A&R job just the way they always have. Warner's also just hired a very famous data scientist to head up a new department that is going to be AI-driven. And this is going to cover everything from finding new artists to their finances to their sales and marketing as well. Now, lest you think that Warner's is the only one that's doing that, all the labels are dipping their toes into this. As a matter of fact, Tencent, the huge Chinese label, also has their own AI A&R app called Instrumental. So in fact, this is becoming widespread in the industry, and we'll see if it actually makes music better or not. If you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@bobbyowsinski.com. Don't forget about my online courses on mixing, production, branding, and music business success at bobbyowsinskicourses.com. Also, get an expert analysis and objective opinion of your songs and mixes as a member of my Hitmakers Club. Go to hitmakersclub.com to learn more. Now, speaking of artificial intelligence, we're all familiar with things like creating fake people for photos, faking voices in speeches, artist holograms, deep fakes, as much of this is called. However, what about deep fake music? There's a company called OpenAI that will allow you to generate music and lyrics using famous people like Frank Sinatra, Katy Perry, Elvis, Simon and Garfunkel, Tupac, Celine Dion, and more. Basically, if you want something to sound like Queen, you just input Queen on one side, and it will output a version of that, only it's all brand new and not done by Queen at all. Just sounds like it. Now, lest you think that this is the only company, there's a bunch of them that are out there doing the same thing. Is this good or bad? Well, the way I look at it is this could change music in a way that maybe we're not thinking about. For instance, if you're a beat maker and you're really good at that, but let's say you're not a really good singer, how about deep faking a Bowie or a Miley Cyrus vocal? It would be you singing, but essentially her voice or Bowie's voice on your track. Now, believe it or not, this is not illegal. There's no legal precedent, in fact, for stealing a voice. It's just too new. So we'll see how this goes down. This may, in fact, be brought to a court near you very soon, mostly because if a streaming network does something like this, where perhaps they do, let's say, an Elvis or a Bee Gees song, and then claim this is old catalog, well, in fact, that could trigger something that could bring this to court, and we'll find out exactly how the court treats it. In the meantime, the music you're listening to may not be real. My guest this week again is Miles Copeland, who formerly managed the Police and created IRS Records. IRS was at the forefront of the punk and new wave movement as the home for bands like REM, the Bangles, Dead Kennedys, the Go Gos, and many others. He also managed Sting in his solo and film careers. Today in part 2 of our interview, we talked about the modest start that the Police got during their first tour of America, being a manager and running a label at the same time, the mentality of music execs in a corporate environment, and much more. I spoke with Miles via phone from his home in Los Angeles. I was always under the impression that college radio played a really big part in that style of music in particular, but your roster, I think. Was that true?
It was really, because the if I go way back, the first police tour, I couldn't get arrested in England. I mean, to use a joke on the police, nobody really would pay attention. Okay, so I figured, well, what the hell? If we could get them to America, it's 3 guys and a roadie. We could break even at $300 a night. And my brother Ian was an agent at an agency in America, Paragon Agency down in Macon, Georgia, and they had kind of a vibe that they wished they could get into British music, but who goes to Macon, Georgia? Nobody.
Yeah.
They were into Southern rock. So I think Ian got a job down there, and he knew British music. And he said, well, I called him and I said, look, can you book the Police? And he said, well, you got no record deal, you got nothing, but I can get them in all the dump clubs probably, and I'll try and see what I can do. And next thing you know, he books them in every dive in America. We played places that I don't think even the worst group in America would play. But we did CBGB's, and we did the Rat Club in Boston and this and that, And the Police did one show at a club in probably a disco or something in Syracuse, New York. Okay, 4 people showed up. 4 people. Okay, most groups would walk out and see 4 people in the audience and think, the hell with it, we're not going to play. The Police said, you know what, the 4 people bought tickets. Who are we? We're from England. Nobody knows who the hell we are. Let's give these guys a real treat. So they walk out on that stage and they do a killer show. One of the 4 people was a college radio station DJ at MIT University in Boston, who had his own little punk show. His name was Oedipus.
Oh.
And he was so enamored with the Police, they gave him the single that had come out in England, the Roxanne single. He went back to MIT and started banging that single. And then BCN, which he later became the program director for, started playing it. Other stations started playing it, and it became a regional hit. So Oedipus has a huge role to play in the beginning of the Police. And, when you look at, and people always say to me, what was the most important gig that you ever did? And they were thinking I would answer something like Shea Stadium, or we played to 80,000 people or whatever. I say, no. The most important gig, Syracuse, to 4 people. What? And I say, well, because one of those 4 people changed the whole game, He played that record on the radio. It became a regional hit, and it showed up on the Billboard record charts in the 78, beginning of 79. It showed up on the record charts. So Jerry Moss saw that. Of course, he reads Billboard. He wasn't going to read Sniffing Glue magazine or any fanzine or anything like that. He was looking at Billboard, and he sees the name Police there. Next to it is A&M Records. Of course, it was the import, And so he calls me up, and he says, is this my act? And I said, well, it is. And he says, well, we better do something. I said, yeah, you better. So Oedipus at college radio at MIT, I would say in many, many ways, he was sort of the Michael Plen. He was the first step in the Police succeeding, and then Michael Plen later on with the Go Gos. So you look at some of these key guys who were relatively, who would appear to be relatively insignificant guys from a relatively insignificant gig, but they were instrumental in making something happen. So it always made me think, that don't be too proud. You walk out on a stage and there's only a few people there, because you never know who's in that audience. It might be somebody important. Always go for your best. And don't write somebody off because they don't have any credits.
Yeah, yeah.
Michael Plen, what credits did he have? He was a college kid. Jay Boberg, what credits did he have? Nothing. He'd been in the record. He was still in college, for Christ's sake. But look to the talent. Look, do they have the chutzpah? Do they have the drive? Do they have that something? Look for that instead of reading some resume. And I think that was probably a lesson I learned early on. It was that resumes and all this, they can always be doctored and made up. I'm looking at, I did my memoir. I was writing my memoir earlier this year, so I'm locked down in L.A., and I'm looking up some of the old people that I worked with, and I'm reading their resumes. I'm finding out they helped me found a label, or they helped me found a publishing. Wait a minute, that guy joined the company 2 years after we started it, And It's amazing, how you can doctor a resume. So when I think about it, I think, there are those people that just because somebody doesn't have a resume doesn't mean that they're not good. Make a judgment based on, almost your gut instinct, And I think that was really how we started IRS. But a lot of it was I had no choice,
Yeah,
if Jay Boberg had said I need $50,000, I would have said no. The fact that he accepted $100 a week and he seemed to know what he was doing and was ready to give it a shot, I'd say yeah.
The interesting thing was I was in Boston at that time when Oedipus was playing that record. I was in music school at Berkeley, and for some reason it caught on in the Berkeley community, where the Police was the hot thing before they really broke out. And the one thing I remember was they played the Paradise Club, and it was broadcast on BCN. And everybody that I knew at Berkeley that couldn't get a ticket was crowded around radios. We're all listening together. It was very influential, surprisingly enough. And you'd think at a music school that's, at that time it was mostly jazz bows. No, the Police really captured everybody there. So for what it's worth.
Yeah, well, we first did Boston. It was at the Rat Club on that first tour, and Oedipus wasn't there actually. For some reason, he went to see us in Syracuse. I don't know. I actually never did figure out why he saw them there, but we did the Rat Club, and it wasn't until later that we did the Paradise.
Mm-hmm.
But they had. I think the secret was that they were. It was kind of minimalist, and the Roxanne sound was something that, again, like I say, when they played that in the studio, Stewart, Andy, and Sting didn't want to play the song. They said Miles is going to hate it. It's a ballad. Because remember, it was the punk rock time. Punk rock was all about, bash him up and your stance, and it was bah, 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 bah. It was all heavy duty, raucous, kick everybody in the ass, be against everything, stuff. Whereas Roxanne was a sweet love song, very minimal, slow ballad, and it was the antithesis of punk, really. But it mixed a bit of reggae in there,
Yeah.
And it just had this something about it, When I heard that song, I had gone in to the studio thinking I was going to hear a punk group, And my first criticisms, really, of the songs were, well, they're not aggressive enough, they're this and that, And so by the time it came to Roxanne, which was the last song they played me, the band had decided that I was going to hate it because it was, if all the others weren't raucous enough, well, this one definitely wasn't. But the engineer got kind of tired of us bickering. I said, look, I'm here. I've driven an hour to get to the studio. Play the damn song, And the engineer finally just stuck it on. He said, what the hell? He wanted to stop us arguing. So he plays this song, and I'm listening to this thing thinking, man, this is completely different. It just showed the Police in a completely different light. And I looked at those guys, and I said, guys, that's a classic. You've written a classic. And they looked at me like I had two heads. They said, what? You like that? And, of course, Sting then pops out later on with, Can't Stand Losing You, and the whole reggae influence popped in. But I went to A&M the next day, and I played them that song, and that got us the deal, So there was something special in the Police, and I think it was honest, But I think the reality was, or Roxanne was honest to what the Police were, whereas the first couple of singles that we put out on the Police, which was Fall Out and whatever, they were really punky. They weren't really that honest, but the band has really become, because when you have an Andy Summers on guitar and you have Sting and Stewart, you have guys that really can play, and they're show them at the best light, and Roxanne did that, it was sort of understated and whatever, it worked, and that made things happen, and I guess Oedipus heard that just like I did,
How did you reconcile management and running a label at the same time? Because it's so difficult to do one or the other, let alone both.
Well, thankfully, the Police understood. I think they were a little bit older, and they understood that there were certain advantages of having a manager who had his fingers on the pulse in a number of other ways as well. And that the stronger I was, the stronger it helped them become as well, And they allowed me to put on the support groups. So I said, well, if the police are going to go out, I'll put the Cramps to open, or Scafish, or Wall of Voodoo, or whoever, So the police were pretty open with letting me put on support bands, number one. But number two, I think they began to appreciate that I had guys at IRS Records here in Los Angeles and around the country who were working on IRS Records, but they were also giving me information on what A&M was doing with the police and squeeze, And I was always very careful with the guys. I was saying, look, whatever you do, do not make A&M people afraid to tell you something and to cut you out of meetings, because I want to know what's going on, And I was very careful not to go to Jerry Moss and say, well, look, you're spending more money on Peter Frampton than you are on the police. What are you doing? So, but that information, it's like knowledge is power. I had guys, it's almost like they talk about during World War II, the fifth column, your people that are, I had my own people sitting in on all the meetings, So I knew what A&M was spending on all the different labels and what their attitudes were on everybody, And that helped me with the police. And I think the band understood that there was a certain value to that. And they gave me the latitude. But you're right. I think if they had been very jealous and they were saying, well, you're spending more time on IRS Records than you are us, and how come you do it? It might not have worked. But I think that the IRS A&M, because I think also you have to keep in mind is that we were bucking the system. Everybody wrote off the police in the beginning. Everybody wrote off IRS Records. People thought it was all cute and all that, but is this real? I don't think anybody really paid that much attention. So, when it's like the old saying, beggars can't be choosy.
Mm-hmm.
So if a college station was going to play my music, fantastic. MTV comes along, and everybody wrote them off. Even people forget that MTV was not something that everybody immediately jumped at. There were a lot of bands that said, well, we're not going to give you any videos. They said they would play my stuff. And so as far as I was concerned, great. I'm your biggest fan. You'll play my stuff. Fantastic. The fact that you got nobody listening to you, who cares? At least you're something, So it was like, grasping at straws, And so I think we were bucking the system and effectively changing the system, even though we didn't necessarily know it at the time. But I think that was really why it worked for me to be able to say I was a record company and a manager, because one tended to help the other. I used my management, clout with the police and squeeze or whatever to give opportunities for the IRS acts to open those shows. REM played with the police at Shea Stadium, for instance. So the police afforded me the opportunity to put bands on with them. But the vice versa is that IRS gave me information that it was helpful to me to help promote the police. So one hand tended to work with the other,
Let's jump ahead to CIA. And I'm actually very excited to talk to you about this because I'm really a big fan of, I hate to use the term world music, but music that's not particularly Western. And that's what you're specializing in, right?
Yeah. Well, I had gotten into that when I finally, the story of IRS Records, I find actually pretty fascinating. And there was a guy, we're actually doing a documentary on IRS Records, which will hopefully be out next year and on Showtime or something, And the guy came to me and said, look, I want to make a documentary on IRS Records. And I said, well, look, I'm not interested in, okay, I signed this and aren't I great, and this happened and this happened and this happened. I said, that's really not interesting. I said, what's really interesting about IRS Records is we started with everybody thinking we were a joke. We signed up acts for nothing. We were breaking every rule because we could. It was cheap to do so. People gave us latitude. And as we began to grow, a lot of the things that we were rebelling against in the beginning, we actually ended up becoming at the end. So when IRS finally sold to EMI, I said, look, we became a corporate company. When the accountants walked in and said, okay, all right, Miles, here's your task for this year. You've got to make this much money. If you make that money, you get your Christmas bonus. If you don't make that money, fuck you. You're out of here.
Mm.
And when you have that happening, all of a sudden, you have to start thinking, well, I need acts that are guaranteed sellers. They need me to make this number. All of a sudden, you start looking at resumes, because you need to prove to the people you weren't stupid, So flying by, the seat of your pants and your gut instinct, all of a sudden becomes a little bit harder to do because now there's real money involved, And I saw IRS go from this radical, strange, do whatever you want label where I could sign up the craziest groups. And I did. I signed up crazy groups who were fantastic, but they were nuts, a lot of them. The Cramps were crazy, but they were fantastic, But at the end, I was forced to sign up people that I would have not normally wanted to sign up because I thought they could put numbers on the table, So I saw the label move from this, wild cowboy era to, all of a sudden I'm on Wall Street. It's like I got to deliver the goods that the corporate people wanted. And that was a real problem. And so finally we terminated, when EMI finally started closing labels. They closed Virgin, they closed one after another, and IRS was one of them. And then I was forced, I said, well, I'm going to start a new label, which became the CIA label. And I was in a situation where I was going to fund this myself. I really didn't want to borrow money from another company. And I looked out and said, well, who has problems getting their records out in America? Well, it's a lot of these artists that were around the world that people weren't considering because they're not singing in English. So, you have a group from, Algeria or from Egypt or from India or whatever, and we call that world music, but it's music in a different language, Okay, even Spanish artists were having trouble in America, You have your Latin division and this and that, but there were certain rock acts that nobody paid attention to. Well, that's not really Latin, when they would say, oh, well, Heroes del Silencio in Spain. They're singing rock music, but it just happens to be in Spanish. So that's not really world music. So what was called rock en español was not really considered something that America would be interested in. So I would find a lot of these amazing acts that were selling millions of records around the world, but nothing in America, Clandestino by Manu Chao sold 2 million records in France. Nothing in America. So I signed it for nothing. And I put it out, and we did very well with it, So I was gravitated to world music largely because I could afford to get into that game, and actually because I was making judgments based on, do I like this music? The fact that it's in a language I don't really understand, do I really care? The old days of rock and roll. I remember many, many years ago, there was a comedian by the name Stan Freberg, and he had a sketch where he would go like, I'm in a rock band, and he has a producer. The producer says, well, I can understand all the words. Here, stick this rag in your mouth. And because boo-bop-a-loo,
Yeah, right.
I was like, well, who cares? Bebop-a-lula, when did lyrics matter? So well, they mattered when you had a Bob Dylan or whatever. But in the early days of rock and roll, did you really care? Hound Dog, what was that about? Elvis Presley, Hound Dog. So a lot of the early songs were pretty minimal, and who cared about it was really the vibe of it. So I sort of applied the same message to world music that, one applied to rock and roll in the very early days of rock and roll, where who understood the words? I remember Wooly Bully, when I was in college and in doing undergraduate work, there were so many different versions of, well, hey, I got the real lyrics to Wooly Bully. Here, listen to them. And it was like, Wooly Bully, if you listen to that record, you could almost think you could think it's Shakespeare for argument's sake,
Yeah.
But who knew? It didn't matter. No. So there's a lot of great music out there in the world that, whether you understand the lyric or not, but it's the vibe. And there was this one artist by the name of Sheb Mami, who was from Algeria, and his voice was so magical that when I heard that music, and it was he incorporated Middle Eastern sounds, but he also incorporated Western sounds. He had the Western bass and Western drums, along with the oud and the qanun and these various exotic instruments from Algeria. So it was like the marriage of my rock and roll world with my Middle East world that I had subliminally kind of become attached to without even knowing it. So all of a sudden I heard, Khalid and Cheb Mami and Faudel and a lot of these bands that were in Algeria, because they had moved to France. They had adopted rock and roll instrumentation, added it to their Arabic instrumentation, and came up with a whole new sound. And when I heard that sound, I thought, man, this is just fantastic. And I played it to Sting, who unbelievably liked it. And that led to Desert Rose with Cheb Mami singing it, But again, it was this voice that was just magical. And I heard the voice. I mean, it was this amazing way of singing, but who cared what he sang about? It didn't really matter, But it did matter to the powers that be at the record company, because I remember when I went into Universal with this Desert Rose single, and I assumed it was going to be the second single off the Brand New Day album that Sting did. And I'd ask people, what's your favorite song on the record? Everyone to a man would say, Desert Rose. And I go, okay, well then obviously that's the next single. And they go, oh, no, it can't be the next single. Well, why not? Well, it's got this Arab guy on it, and we don't know what the hell he's singing about, And I go, yeah, but what's your favorite song on the record? Oh, Desert Rose. But then why isn't that a single? Oh, no, because it broke the rules. Okay, you're not supposed to start the song off with this voice that we don't know what it is, and it's in some weird Arab dialect, And so I actually had somebody say to me, take the Arab guy off, and maybe we'll put the record out. And I said, yeah, but then you're not going to like the record, which, of course, they agreed. So it was like a catch-22. And it wasn't until we made a video for Europe, because in Europe they weren't so precious about language. And I saw this video, and I thought, well, the car in the video is fantastic. And, my God, we made a car commercial. So I went to Jaguar, and they got excited about it, and they decided they would buy TV ads using the music, and that made Desert Rose a hit, And the record company hadn't even intended to put it out until people started phoning a radio station and saying, why aren't you playing the new Sting single? And the radio would say, well, what Sting single? The one about the desert and the rose and the car. And they go, well, they would call a record company and they'd say, what's the matter with you people? Why didn't you give me the Sting single? Why is my station being precluded? And the record company was like, well, what Sting single? What are you talking about? And they go, no, what about the desert, the car, the rose? And the record company started realizing what the hell had happened here, that these commercials were going out that Jaguar was paying for. It was an $18 million commercial buy, They bought the Super Bowl, for Christ's sake. And the record company rushed the single out. It went top 10. It was Sting's biggest hit, for many years, And it just goes to show that the public did the same thing I did. They listened to the music and thought, wow, that's great, And the fact that it was in a language they didn't understand, who cared? It was the vibe of it that really worked. But, there are a lot of rules in the music business, and you're sitting there and you're dealing with lots of money, and you're looking at the rule book and thinking, well, can I get away by doing this? Are people going to look like I'm foolish for putting something out that's in a foreign language? So Desert Rose would have been written off had it not been for Jaguar, And the same goes for a lot of the music that I put out. Clandestino from Manu Chao would have been forgotten, never released in America. I released it, and to this day, it stands as one of the greatest albums I ever released, even though it's mostly in Spanish,
I was in Sydney a few years ago, and there was a concert that was on the steps of the famous opera house, and the lead act was called Sarong Samurai. The most fantastic new sound I've heard in a long time. They were from Papua New Guinea. And what they did was they incorporated traditional instruments. But sometimes what it's like with Western instruments, but sometimes it just feels like it's tacked on, like it's just there. In this case, it was integrated so well. And then they had dancers that would come out and do traditional dances, but then they'd break into the New York punk beat boy hip-hop style. And next thing you know, they'd be singing in perfect 3-part, 4-part, 5-part harmony. And it was just the most fantastic blend of indigenous music with Western music I've ever seen. Plus the visuals they had were every bit as good as what you can get from Hollywood. It just excited me so much because it was like, this is the future of music. It's not what we're basically experiencing in the United States. It's something like this, which is taking a new avenue.
If you go back to the early days of rock and roll, okay, effectively the same thing was happening. I mean, people said of Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis and whatever, they're playing black music. But basically what Elvis Presley did, or Jerry Lee Lewis and a lot of these people did, they brought black music that had probably originated in Africa, had been festering in New Orleans and in Chicago and some of these places. And these white guys come along and they take that element of it and add something else to it. So rock and roll is a hybrid. It's a hybrid of white and black mixed together, And the whites made it something that, the blacks were not necessarily playing to whites. But the fact that white guys started playing it, all of a sudden they were exposed. So people started discovering B.B. King and Muddy Waters and a lot of these guys that they'd forgotten. And the Rolling Stones and all these bands. And remember the Beatles or whatever, a lot of the early stuff the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and all these bands were doing was really music from the ghettos of America, black music, you know. So I think the hybrid music, whether it be indigenous from Papua New Guinea or the Algerian music that I was hearing that was gone to France, and it was Algerian Arab music mixed with Western rock, or rock en español that was, rock with sung in Spanish, but also they added this certain elements into it that you wouldn't necessarily have heard, where you hear Peruvian flutes or this and that. To me, hybrids are really what's interesting. And a lot of the greatest, the Police is one of the greatest examples of a hybrid. You've got punk, pop, and reggae merged together in some kind of a mix that made it different. The Pink Floyd, you go down the list of the big bands, and most of them were basically hybrid groups that they were lifting, stealing a bit from here and a bit from there and whatever, and mixing them together and coming up with new combinations, like a chemistry set, So I've had times where people have said, well, you're culturally appropriating. Yeah, of course we are. That's what makes things grow. That's what makes things happen. That's what other people have done to Western music and Western people have done to other people's music, is that it's all about culturally mixing it up. Because then you begin to appreciate things you never would appreciate. Who would have appreciated Arabic music to the degree if Sting hadn't done Desert Rose? All of a sudden, people like Sheb Mami and Khalid and Fodel and all these people were getting recognized where they might not have been recognized. Or a lot of the Indian music, that was happening when you have some. There's great musicians all over the world, and it's the hybrid of them that really makes it interesting. So to me, world music. The beauty of world music is that it's such a rich resource because you've got all these different countries with all these different cultures and different instruments and this and that. So you never know where the next weird sound is going to come. It's just something's fantastic. It came out of middle of Africa or middle of some island in the Pacific. Who knows? But those hybrids to me is what's interesting. But really, it's a process that's gone on for a long, long time, and people forget that rock and roll started that way too.
Well, the interesting thing, and this kind of leads me to another place that I want to talk to you about. You've always been starting on a shoestring, raging against the machine, so to speak. Now we kind of have a big change in the music business, which started the same way. We started with hip-hop, started on a shoestring, and became the heart of at least the pop music business now. How do you see what the business is like today?
Well, I think the business is changing all the time, even when you don't recognize it. My kids listen to stuff that's different than I was listening to. What I was listening to, my father objected to. He was into big band jazz, So there's always this progression, But there tends to be these doldrum periods, where everybody tends to copy everybody else, because that's the latest hit, and it kind of goes in phases. And that's really when the punk thing was happening. My view was, well, this is the end of one phase and the beginning of a new one. Whereas most people were thinking that it's just a continuation of the previous phase, and these new people can't play, so therefore dismiss them. Where I was thinking, well, it's a new generation; they're gonna come forward. So I think 10 years from now, you ask the same question, and the music's going to be different. But I think hip hop. I mean, people have realized now that you can talk a song as well as sing a song. So you can hear, and now you see bands, whether it be Aerosmith or whoever, who mix together. When they'll get a punk group, they'll get a rap group, and they'll mix it with a rock song or something, and they'll end up with something different. So to me, I like the whole hybrid thing. The distribution of music has changed. Now that it's Spotify, whatever. Although in a way, it's now easier to hear music coming out of strange places. I mean, I know my kids, they'll be listening to some record, and I'll think, well, where's that from? And it's from Norway or something, where it's so easy now to hear songs that are coming from some of these other places that perhaps the world has opened up more to more influences. But I think that music is a moving target. I think in 10 years from now, the music will be different again, and 10 years after that, and 10 years after that. I mean, maybe it's in 10-year cycles, I don't know. But I think that, for me to make a comment on what I see music today, I mean, it'll be irrelevant 10 years from now,
Yeah.
Just as it was probably, when people were commenting about punk rock and telling me, well, it'll never happen. I mean, I was told with the Police, go home. This music will never happen in America. I was literally told that, And when I started the label, people were said, it's a no-hoper, it would never last, And the Go Gos were told they'll never happen, The Bangles, go down the list, And, the Beatles were rejected by every record company in England, So I think rejection is almost a sign that you're going to succeed. Like, well, give me something that got rejected, it's probably going to happen.
Yeah. Last question, Miles. What's the best piece of business advice that maybe somebody imparted to you, or maybe you learned along the way?
I've had a lot of thinking about this kind of subject because I was writing my memoir, and when you're writing that, you're beginning to think back about, well, why did something happen, and why did this other thing not happen? I mean, I had acts that were at least as talented as the Police or Squeeze or whatever, and you say, why did that act happen and this other one didn't happen? And I would say there are some lessons that I learned along the way, and one of the ones that I would say, is important for people to realize is that make the answer yes easy, and you're likely to get yes as an answer. And in a way, that goes to the same thing as make it cheap enough to be able to afford, and somebody's likely to buy it. Okay, if it's too expensive, it's like if a car comes along and it costs you $1,000, you think, what the hell? I'm going to buy a car. If it costs you $100,000, you got to think seriously about whether you're going to buy it or not. So, in the same way, if I gone to Jerry Moss and I said, well, let's make a record label, IRS Records, it's going to be huge. And I said, but I need $1 million. He would have told me to get out of his office,
Yeah.
But the fact that I said I wanted nothing, I made yes easy. The other thing I would say is that when you look at the world and you say, well, what is the combinations that work? Why did me with the Police and the three members of why did that work and me and Walla Voodoo didn't? Okay. Stan Ridgway is one of the great lyricists. He's humor. He's got all sorts of elements to him. Walla Voodoo was a brilliant group, And, you look at this idea of, to me, the trick of business is you take one and you make it equal 3. That's the ingredients of success, whether it would be Wozniak and Steve Jobs. 1 and 1, they made 3, But it's a two-sided coin, Me and Sting, we made 3. Me and Voodoo, it was 1 and 1, and it didn't work, Why didn't it work? And so, in a way, it's like you could look at yourself and think, well, I'm a key ingredient. But then again, it's the other side is a key ingredient as well. So it's really a combination of ingredients that tend to work. And it's usually not one person. Why did IRS happen? yes, it was me largely. But if it hadn't been for Michael Plen, if it hadn't been for Barbara Boland and the various other people in the company that helped make the label happen, would the Go Gos have happened? No, it probably wouldn't have. So it is a combination of things that make things work. But in the end, the starting off point has to be like, okay, if it's not affordable, you're not going to get people to participate. If the yes is not easy, then you're not going to get anybody to go for it. So you've got to make the entry easy. If the entry is easy enough, then it's down to you to make it work. But if the entry is not easy, then you've got to rely on luck. And I'm afraid that luck is one of those fickle things. It might work one day, but not another. And do you want to leave your future and your whole life in the hands of luck? Well, for me, no. So I think that I think luck is important, but you can make your own luck by making it easy to get into the game.
You can find out more about Miles at milescopeland.com. That's Miles Copeland, all one word, .com. Thanks for listening and being in my inner circle. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@bobbyowsinski.com. To listen to other episodes of Bobby Owsinski's Inner Circle, go to bobbyowsinski.com and select the podcast tab, or go to bobbyowinnercircle.com, or you can find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Mixcloud, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Deezer, TuneIn Radio, Radio Public, and Podbean. At bobbyowsinski.com and bobbyowinnercircle.com, you'll also find a sign-up form for my newsletter and for alerts for new podcasts. This is Bobby Owsinski. I will see you next time.